I'm Ann Dart.
I'm Tracy Stormy.
And I'm Kathy Knight.
And together we are
It Was a Dark and Stormy Book Club,
a podcast for mystery lovers.
Welcome.
Welcome back. On today's episode, we are going to have an interview with Andrew Shaffer, who wrote the Obama-Biden mystery series.
This mystery thriller reunites Vice President Joe Biden and President Barack Obama for a political mashup full of suspense, intrigue, and laugh-out-loud bromance. Andrew Shaffer is the New York Times best-selling author of Hope Never Dies, an Obama-Biden mystery, the parody 50 Shames of Earl Grey, and numerous other humorous works of fiction and nonfiction. He is a two-time Goodreads Choice Award nominee and a one-time finalist in the humor category. Shaffer attended the Iowa Writers Workshop and studied comedy writing at Chicago's famed The Second City. Oh, he didn't mention that.
He did not. That's pretty big.
Yep. An Iowa native, Shaffer lives in Lexington, Kentucky with his wife, novelist Tiffany Rise. We had a lot of fun speaking with Andrew, so stay tuned for our interview.
We would like to welcome Andrew Shaffer to the show. He is the author of Hope Never Dies. We welcome Andrew.
Hello. Thanks for having me on, Tracy and Kathy.
Well, Andrew, we thoroughly enjoyed Hope Never Dies, so we are really anticipating your next book. And we can't help but wonder if you have come up with a totally new mystery for Obama and Biden to solve. Can you talk about that at all?
Yeah, so the first book, they solve a crime in Delaware that sort of deals with the opioid crisis and some other things in there, but it's a crime where an Amtrak conductor gets hit by a train, and Joe sort of thinks that foul play is involved. Now, so for the second book, I wanted to go outside of Joe's territory, and so we're going to Chicago for the second book, which is called Hope Rides Again, and that's going to be a totally new mystery. It's set a couple months, probably 6 months after the events of the first book or so, 6 to 9 months, and so it's going to be still while Joe is deliberating running for president, because I don't know what he's going to do this spring, but it's more of a buddy cop story than the first one, because the first one had them sort of split up and then they get back together, and the second one they're together the whole time. So I think people will have a lot of fun with it, but it also does sort of tackle some serious issues with violence in Chicago.
I understand that Chicago is pretty notorious for having a lot of crime.
Chicago's an interesting place. It's always been notorious for crime ever since it was founded in this country. So it's always had an issue, whether it was the sort of the Wild West atmosphere that it started with, or Al Capone and the gangster era, to a lot of the violence that we see right now on the south side of Chicago. It's always had a really violent aspect to it. It is a very natural setting for a noir story.
I've been to Chicago a couple of times, but I've only seen the pretty side of Chicago.
Yeah, it's interesting. You can go there and you can take an Al Capone tour or whatever, and they sort of celebrate with a wink and a nod the violent history, but you're like, well, there are still parts of it that are violent. It's not necessarily a thing of the past, but I think every city does that to some degree. They sort of romanticize what happened 100 years ago. They're like, oh, here's our brothels. And I'm like, you probably have similar issues today somewhere in your town.
Yeah.
Oh, definitely.
Absolutely. So the biggest question is, what inspired you to write a mystery with Obama and Biden as the protagonist?
I'd always wanted to write a mystery with Joe Biden as a protagonist, sort of like a Walter Mitty, where he would have ideas in his head of little crimes he's solving around the White House. Maybe there's a missing cat or something, or because everybody says that the vice president doesn't have anything to do really. And so I thought it would be fun to have this guy walking around, because he has those aviator shades on. So he just looked like this really ridiculous sort of action hero almost. And I thought it'd be fun to play off of that, but it never really got off the ground until they were on their way out of the office and those Obama Biden memes started to go around. And so I was like, well, what if I throw them together and it's more of like a buddy cop story than just a Joe Biden story? And that's what got the publisher interested interested in doing the book eventually. So from there, it was pretty fast. We found a publisher right away, and they were just like, great, write it. And it happened.
Well, it was very clever.
Well, I guess that kind of answers the next question a little bit, since you've been interested in Joe Biden all along, or how much research went into just getting all of Obama's and Biden's idiosyncrasies down pat, because you did do very well.
Yeah, there's a fine line you have to walk between getting to know them too well and then getting to play up to what their public image is, because as I was researching, I would find out that Joe Biden swears quite a bit, and it's kind of a filthy mouth at times. He's dropped an F-bomb here or there, but his public image for the most part is this malarkey and gosh darn, I'm upset. And so at a certain point when I was reading these behind the scenes books and listening to their autobiographies and all this kind of stuff, you learn little stuff about them and you go, if it jars with what the public thinks about them, I don't really want to include that. So there was a fine line between doing too much research, and at some point I just had to put the books down and start writing.
Well, I have to admit that before I read this book, I really didn't know a lot about Joe Biden's past, and I didn't know about his failed run for president.
Yeah, I didn't remember that.
Yeah, that's probably for the best, right? Yeah, he actually had a really good shot at the presidency in '88, and you could have seen that happening very easily, but the problem was that he was on this committee doing these Supreme Court hearings for the Justice Bork nomination, which he still considers one of his greatest achievements, is railroading this guy out of the way of the Supreme Court. But it's mostly forgotten today. You don't remember the people that were up for the Supreme Court that didn't get it. You remember the ones that are on there.
And you definitely don't remember the people that were responsible.
Right behind the scenes.
Yeah, behind the scenes.
Yeah, and they're like, people would watch it on TV every day, and I was like, that sounds really, boring. Because he wanted to show off how smart he was. He's like, I didn't go to an Ivy League school, but I know he was a lawyer, and he knew law, and he wanted to kind of show it off, and he did. But at the same time, you're like, oh, this is all kind of boring.
So out of curiosity, have you ever been to Delaware, and especially some of the seedy areas that you describe in the book?
While I was writing the book, I'd driven probably through accidentally. If you're driving around the Northeast, you can't help but accidentally drive through Delaware or Connecticut or some of these smaller states, but I had never really stopped there or anything until I wrote the book. And while I was writing the book, I picked up all the books I could on Delaware, which was 2. And that sounds like a joke, but it's not. There were 2 books that I could find on what to do if you're moving to Delaware or something. And I was like, oh, it was like 20 pages long too. So, I went online, I did a lot of research with Google Maps, and I always go to like these message boards that are used by people in cities. So I sort of find out what's going on the ground there, what people really think, without having to actually go there. Because I was on such an accelerated time frame. I had 6 months to write the book and revise it. So I just didn't have enough time to be going around the country and looking at different stuff. And so when I got there on my book tour, I did 3 or 4 events there, and thank God they were all great. People there really overwhelmingly loved the book. I thought they were going to come out and burn me at the stake or something, but I had the best crowds and very engaged audience for the readings and everything. But I didn't have a lot of time when I was there to dawdle around, so I didn't see any parts of Wilmington really. It was basically I went to the beach, Rehoboth Beach, and then I went to a little part of Wilmington. That was all I saw, was just very little. I can't wait to go back. It's such an interesting state. They've got all these cows and cornfields and stuff all around. It reminded me of growing up in Iowa. It's like they've kind of got this sort of, this little homey atmosphere that's like right in the middle of the eastern seaboard. And you're like, how did this happen?
Well, being from Maryland, we are very proud of our state, but we know in Baltimore there's some areas that we wouldn't walk around at night. So it doesn't take away from the pride. So I'm sure Delaware feels the same way.
Well, they were probably thrilled to have another book written about that.
Yeah, it was funny. I did have one woman come up. I talk about this apartment complex in the book that's kind of a bad-looking apartment complex set down in a really beautiful old colonial type neighborhood. And she said, how did you know what my apartment complex was like? That was kind of weird, how accurate that was. And I said, I was just on Google Maps, just kind of buzzing buzzing around the city until I saw something that looked horrifyingly noir-like that would fit into the book. And she's like, you described it perfectly.
Well, I have to say that's a great idea to go on Google Earth and map and look around. That's a wonderful research tool.
Oh, yeah. You can do so much now that you couldn't have done even 10 years, 20 years ago as far as researching. I'd love to say, oh, I go to the library and I sit there all day and blah, blah, blah. But the fact is, you can do so much from your computer right now that it's just such a great research tool at your fingertips.
Absolutely. I think writers today are a little spoiled compared to what they used to have to go through before.
Yeah. So have Obama or Biden given any opinion of your book?
Well, I did run into Joe Biden when he was in Kentucky a couple months ago when he was campaigning for one of our local candidates here. And his people got a hold of me and they said, Joe's coming through and he'd like to talk to you. And I said, uh-oh. I hadn't heard anything from him up until that point, so I knew he was aware of the book because he had taken a photo next to it, so I knew that he knew it was out there, but I didn't know what he thought about it. But apparently at that time, I don't think he had read the book. The people that worked for him for the campaigning that he was doing, they were fans of the book, and he was having people come up to him at rallies and stuff and asking him to sign the book. So I think he was like, I want to talk to this guy. I want to find out what's going on here. And so when we met, we talked for a few moments and he signed the book for me. So that was very nice. But he basically said, great job. And I was like, well, wait till you read it, sir. I know that Obama is certainly aware of the book because we tried to get him a copy and his people were like, oh, no, he already has a copy or something. But I haven't heard what his thoughts are on it. But if you look at the Obama reading list that he puts out every year, he really likes really heavy books.
Yes, he does.
Literary fiction, really heavy subjects for nonfiction, which is great. But I can't see him picking up a mystery novel. I can see him throwing it across the room. So.
Well, who knows? Maybe it'll be a guilty pleasure or something.
Maybe. One of the plot points in the next book is that some idiot has written a mystery novel starring them, and it just really ticks them off that this is out there. So it gets a little bit meta, but there's some fun scenes with that in the next book.
Now I'm curious, who is the person that has surprised you the most that's reached out to you about this book, other than Joe Biden?
A lot of Obama's previous staffers have reached out, and I've talked to them and stuff. And, I wasn't...
Did they say you nailed it?
For the most part, yeah.
Did they give you any tips of things you should include in the next book?
No, they didn't, but I was talking to Obama's co-writer on his memoir coming up, who was one of his speechwriters at the White House. He had joked that, now we got to throw out half this memoir of all the stuff that's happened since he's been out of office since he wrote this because it's so accurate.
Yeah, you've got a research tool.
Yeah, so I guess there are people whose brains I could pick if I sort of wanted to. But again, it goes back to the point of I don't want it to be so real that it sort of conflicts with what people think that they're like in private. And I don't want to know either. So it's like when I went to the rally where Joe Biden was and he was up there stumping for our local candidate, he was basically in really angry Joe Biden mode. He's like, fired up. We got to do something. We got to. And I was like, oh, that's not the Joe in my book. The Joe in my book is a little bit more laid back.
The Joe in your book.
Yeah.
The characters in the book are definitely divergent from real life. And I think I want to probably keep it that way. I haven't decided what we're going to do if he decides to run, but I think we'll have advanced copies of the book here within the next couple of months. And the book comes out in July. So at that point, it's too late to really change what we have. It is set last year in 2018. So that's one thing going for this book is it's sort of a snapshot of time.
That's very true. We are definitely looking forward to the next book.
What other political characters would you like to turn into detectives? Maybe Michelle and Jill?
I do have some more Michelle in the next book. I wanted to keep them out of the first book because I wasn't sure how the book was going to be received, if they're like, keep our wives out of this or something. But from everything I've heard, I don't think their wives would be too upset to be characters in there. I'm trying to think. I did do one book before this that was called The Day of the Donald, which was a murder mystery that featured a hypothetical future where Donald Trump was president. And that came out during the primaries in 2016, and so nobody thought that was going to happen. I said the next book that I write, if it happens, it's going to have to be something that would really kick ass. And so that's why I decided to do the detective novel. If I do another thing with politicians, I mean, I'm going to have to be really careful because I think I have this power to where some of this stuff sort of comes true. I don't know. I mean, I'm not going to say it predicts the future or anything, but it was like the first time that